Yep, I can hear you well.
Thank you. Good evening there, I guess. Let me just tell you what's going on here. We have a small group here at Fort Eustis, which are people from our Training and Doctrine Command and our Army Futures Command and our Foreign Liaison officers that are here. We're virtually connected to a chat room that has had at different times between 100 and 140 individuals who are from all over interacting, talking about the content. We're also live streaming the event, so a lot of people interested in the topic today. Earlier today, I know you saw the agenda, but we had an officer from the French Army, an officer from the Netherlands, and an officer from Germany, or somebody from the German Bundeswehr, talking about their perspectives of the future. So this is, that's the perspective we have, and we'll pull some of the strings on that when we go to question and answer with you at the end of your presentation. For everybody online in the room, Colonel Isacsson, who's the Assistant Head, Development and Concepts and Doctrine Center for Futures in the UK Ministry of Defense. But as I told you before we left, Colonel Isacsson is a Swedish Marine artillery officer, so we get a twofer here. We get the UK perspective from a Swedish Marine, which is a very mad scientist-like thing. His bio says he's been with the UK since 2013. So if that's true, from an American parlance, that would be he's homesteading in the UK. But that's great. He has a wide range of experience with the Swedish Army at all the way up through battalion command. With different units, different provincial military education, and has served overseas in numerous locations. So great to hear your perspective today, and you go ahead and start, and then we'll do question and answer period, sir.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to present today. And I realize there is a challenge looking at the program that some of the things I will be talking about has already been talked about, that there might be some mainstream thinking here. But I'm going to do my best to present to you some of the challenges when we look into how we best meet the future from a defense point of view. And if we can have the next slide, please. So if this is working, you're having a beautiful oil painting by William Turner called The Fighting Temeraire, with a good sailing ship, a heroine from the Battle of Trafalgar being towed by a small little tugboat powered by new technology, the steam. And why do I show this picture? Well, I think the greatest challenge in every defense culture is to avoid linear thinking, linear platform-based thinking, where you just replace an old platform with a new, more expensive, a bit more capable, without asking yourself, is this really what we need to meet the future challenges and best protect the society we are set to protect them? And to answer that question in a good way, we believe that you need to take a good jump into the future and look back towards today. And if we have next slide, please. So the entire idea with the DC-DC Futures Global Strategic Trends Program is the realization that the future starts today. It starts with the choices we make today, and that those choices will have an impact on the future. So what we try to do is to take a look what the future may look like, because you can't predict, it's just impossible. But you can try to understand how and why the world is changing. And by doing that, we can also identify areas we believe we need to address. And those areas will form basis for policy choices. In the best of world, you can shape the future into something you want it to be, in your best interest. But in most cases, you won't be able to do that. You can't shape away the rise of China. You can't shape away climate change. Then you need to adapt to it and put your nation in the best possible position. So that's what it's all about. Choices today, shape and adapt. Next slide, please. And when we are looking at how the world is changing, we really try to understand the broader picture, all those factors that make the world change. And here we think you can understand the world as a system with humans and an environment and the interface between humans and the environment. And when the system changes, it causes stress that you need to adapt to. And we believe there are 6 drivers of change that are more important than anything else when it comes to understanding how the world is changing. And they are the cornerstones in any operating environment, regardless if it's military, economic, social, or something else. And it starts with humans, changing populations and habitats. What's important here is that we are seeing a trend of aging population where 2050 about 20% of the world's population will be over 60. But the most important thing is that we are looking at an unbalanced population growth with another 2 billion people entering the world from today and 2050. 1 billion will be born in Africa and another one in South Asia, Middle East. The rest of the world will see declining populations and aging. And this is interesting because it poses 2 fundamentally different challenges. In Africa, where the medium age 2050 will be 24 and a half, it's about providing opportunities for young people, while in Europe, Asia, East Asia, which will have a median age about 48 and a half, it's about looking after elderly people and managing ever-increasing welfare costs. Another important factor is that as long as we humans existed, we've always been moving, and this will continue in even greater numbers, where possibly we'll have about 500 million, 400 million people living outside the countries they were born 2050, simply because of cheaper transportation and better awareness of where the opportunities are. So the trend of more multicultural society will continue. And it's also important to see that humans will be ever increasingly part of competition, where there will be a hard competition over skilled people. If you look at, for example, artificial intelligence, we have 50,000 experts in that area today that everybody wants to have to contribute to the economies and the military. So one aspect of power in the future will actually be which places would you want to live with a good education and use your skills. And those places that provide that attraction will be the more powerful places. And it might not be China, for example. If we go to the next another area that is also very important to put into the picture is the changing human habitat. With the increasing urbanization, 2/3 of the human population will live in built-up areas. But what's interesting here is the development of smart cities, heavily dependent on all kinds of technologies for their essential services, in combination with, in many places in the world, unplanned habitats with rapidly expanding urban populations where the hosting capacity is not there. But still a degree of smartness, and cities becoming central for human activity, political, military, economic, and may in the future be actors in their own right. Next driver of change is increasing environmental stress, with 2 billion more people entering the world, increasing consumption, ever demanding, resource demanding cities, the demand for food, water, energy and resources will increase, and also the pressure on environment and on biodiversity, which will have huge implications for our habitat. And this happening at the same time as the human influences on the climate system already is increasing temperature, leading to global warming with more weather extremes that will have a huge disruptive impact and will become ever more costly to mitigate against or repair the damage from. And also, very importantly, be a driver for change, where we may see really rapid disruption of trends in, for example, energy use from a rapid dehydrocarbonization of our energy system into something more environmentally friendly, which will in itself have a huge geopolitical impact. The third driver of change, centrality to information, is probably the most important one. It's founded on ever-increasing amount of data. It's said that the last 2-3 years we produced just as much data as the entire history of mankind. Processing power is constantly increasing, and with the Sycamore computer, which solves a complex problem in 200 seconds that previously took 10,000 years for the best computer today to solve. You can imagine we can do something with all that data, and interconnectivity is enabling us to spread it. And this is foundational for all the technological advances we will see. But it's also leading to a something we call digitization, with an ever closer relationship between humans and data, and a shift away of value from goods to information, where data is the key commodity in the future, and the one who controls the data will be the key power, and that might not be states in the future, which is important to take into account. And with ever more activities in the cyber domain, information becomes central to human activity and conflict, which leads to the question whether the format where we spread information in the cyber domain can be controlled or not. And at least today, most researchers agree that we will never be able to put borders in the cyber domain and control it in the way we control geographical territory. At the same time as the cyber domain may be much more important than geographical territory because of its connection to the absolute essential functions we manage our societies. Another dimension is the ever-expanding information space that will make it very difficult to control how people build their narrative, what they believe is true or not true, and where they put their loyalties. And the one that will make people believe in their narrative will also be the powerful actor in the future. The fourth area is accelerating technological advancements, which I'm sure you heard a lot about, and it's just impossible to say where you start, because you will see improvements in virtually every area of human endeavor. And transformative technologies like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robotics, automation will have profound impacts on economies, societies, and how we fight wars. What is important here is that the transformation into a digitized, automated world would happen much faster than any of these major transitions in history. And it will be a huge question whether societies and economies will cope with this change. If we just think in numbers, in London, about 750,000 people work in the financial sector that may, in a couple of years, need to think about something else to do when they're automated. And how do you cope with that? And of course, this will be transformed into power, because those societies that can manage change, can manage technological change, and still maintain social cohesion will be the strongest powers in the future. And that may not be the great powers of today, because socioeconomic stability is the foundation for a strong state. The fifth driver of change is about human empowerment, which is about the impact on access to information, better education, healthcare that will empower the individual. And in combination with reduction of poverty, will provide more choices. But this is happening at the same time as inequality, technology-driven inequality, just is increasing in the world, and frustration among young people likewise. And you can also ask yourself, how will people react when they actually have some time to spend, not just to survive in absolute poverty, but have some time to see the world, see the injustices at the same time as they are more empowered to mobilize against them. It might be a core driver of tensions and conflict in the future. And the sixth driver of change, I'm sure you're aware of, is that the economic center of gravity is shifting from west to east, which in itself is a positive story because it's driven by the fact that a lot of people is leaving poverty in Asia and got money to consume things for, which drives economic growth. But with economic growth follows political influence, power, military power, and the change of the global power balance that will be continuous theme the coming 3 decades, when the established power of United States will see its shaping power challenged by emerging powers like China that don't want to be shaped but to be part of the shaping, and an ever-increasing multipolarity where other powers and other powers' choices will be important in this perspective. But this is happening at the same time as it becoming ever more difficult to be a state. We do believe that the state will survive the coming 3 decades, but it will be seriously challenged by all the difficulties it will be to deliver whatever more demanding citizens expect from the state. In the West, it will be about the maintenance of the welfare state, and in other parts of the world to develop under completely new conditions with a changing global economy and digitization and people demanding justice and equality. Next picture, please. So if we put all this together and ask ourselves, will the current trend we had at least until 2010 with less conflict in the world, which has been a trend for a long time, continue, or will things change? We've seen an increase in violence since 2010 and it hasn't gone down. Is it a blip or not? And we think it's too early to say that we will see more wars, more conflicts in the world. But what we can say is that when you multiply the drivers of stress, population growth in poor areas, water insecurity, food insecurity, ongoing conflicts, fragile states, and the most important driver of stress, of all drivers of stress, climate change, the prospects doesn't look too incredibly optimistic. And into this picture comes, of course, also increasing power competition in multipolar world. If we change to the next picture, and this is an interesting one, and maybe one of the major question mark where we are heading in the future with an expanding competitive space, where the areas we compete over, you see 6 bullets there. I would say they are timeless. They've always been there. When you study history, they are not new. They've always been a competition over influence and military dominance and security, economic prosperity, access to resources, control over territory, values, ideology, and finally, maybe the most important one, being the power that sets the rules, the shaping power. It is the conditions over how the competition of influence will happen that is changing, where we see a full-scale going from cooperation over competition, confrontation, and possibly an escalation into conflict, where because the major powers are still economically dependent on each other and there are nuclear arms powers, we are more likely to see competition on the threshold level of conflict, but that can possibly escalate, and a competition that is much, much more than just about military strength or economic numbers, but cover the entire scale of diplomacy, information, economy, and very, very important technological leadership. Because if you have the technological leadership, you will be the leading power in the world. And in this competition, we'll also see, as I indicated just a little bit ago, growing importance of alliances and partnership that can tip the power balance. Countries like India that still has a policy on non-alignment. The choices of that country in the future will be important in the global power balance, but also medium-sized powers as such, or grouping of power blocks, and investment and maintenance of alliances will be ever more important if you want to have a greater influence. Next picture, please. So technology is agnostic, can be used for good and bad, and it is. And of course, technology will have a huge influence on conflict and security landscape, where we see a changing character of war. But things we watch is that with the investment in transformative technologies in China, but also in other countries, the technological edge that given West an advantage for a long time is now closing in, and it's an uncertainty whether we will be able to keep that advantage. We also see a proliferation of technologies all over the world, also into non-state actors. And key to what this means to a future conflict is, of course, application of artificial intelligence and automation, and the possibility to fight without humans. Will this change attitudes to war? Will it make it more acceptable? And of course, again, that geography is not protecting you anymore. You can be reached from anywhere through the cyber domain, which is perhaps a bigger threat than ever to a country like United Kingdom with a global financial center like London, which is the bulk of the British economy. Technology is also part of the expanding competitive space, where the global commons will be ever more important, and space particularly. Dominance in space will give you huge advantages in any competition, and today US has a secure advantage in this area with a full ecosystem of skills, competencies, and an interface between state and the business community. So the question here is whether other competitors will be able to build something similar and be able to compete in that area. Development of concern is with the use of biotechnology. We will see new possibilities to develop weapons of mass effect that again can be used by non-state actors to kill a lot of people in a short amount of time. And through biotechnology, war is also becoming more personalized, where you can, with gene hacking and other technologies, hit individuals in a different way than ever been able before. A great threat is globalization of crime and terrorism, use of modern technologies, being ahead of state and justice systems and law, and able to exploit weaknesses of a state and even take parts of a state and take over governance. And estimates about current cost of organized crime reaches from 1.6 to 2.6 trillion US dollars. That's a major size economy in itself. And this might be one of the greater threats to our societies. Next picture, please. However, talking about all these technologies, we need to still recognize that conventional technologies in combination with modern technology gives low entry price to actors that fight asymmetrically to match a conventionally superior opponent, and that the scale from the absolute high tech to applications low tech will still exist and be challenges for any force in a future operating environment. It's also interesting when you look at Middle East, for example, that all of the states in the Middle East is still preparing themselves for another Yom Kippur with massive conventional forces, but fight the conflict with proxies under a threshold level of conflict, and which means that asymmetric warfare may still very rapidly escalate into something else. Next picture, please. And one of the core challenges when you look at the future operating environment, we believe, is the increasing use of a hybrid approach to warfare, hostile activity in a gray zone, either by a state or non-state actor, with a synchronized asymmetric cross-societal threat aiming at hitting at your vulnerabilities and forcing you to give in on something. And the urban terrain as central in this. This is the most complex challenge to meet, and we believe this challenge can only be met by two sides of a coin. One is resilience. The stronger your society is to meet disruptions, the stronger your basic deterrence is. And then, of course, resilience need to be combined with a capacity to respond, to create a credible deterrence. And if you don't have that nationally, you need to work with partners. Next picture, please. If we summarize how we see the future operating environment, it's an ever-increasing complexity. It's most likely to see increased instability very much in urban environments that are very difficult to control. There's a huge degree of uncertainty when it comes to how transformative technologies will be applied, and pervasiveness of information is absolutely fundamental. So next picture, please. So then if we look at today and forward, to compare the current trends in the threat environment, we can see that most of those things we're identifying as major challenges and uncertainties in the future are building up with state-based threats. And very importantly, an erosion of the rule-based international order, which raises real big questions like future of arms control. Will we ever be able to negotiate arms control deals when it comes to biotechnology, new ways of creating weapons of mass effect, and how will this system look in a ever-competitive world? Will we find ways to come back to the negotiation table or not? What will be motives for terrorism in the future? And the bottom one, not least looking at the pandemic spreading from China now, may still be one of the most serious challenges to us, especially if we are hit by pandemics where we can't meet with antibiotics in the future. So next picture, please. So when we think about this and we start thinking about concepts for how to meet those challenges as part of developing of a future British forces, we believe there are 6 areas that needs to be considered. And one is the fact that we are seeing persistent and multifaceted state-on-state competition and confrontation, that it's ever more difficult to say what's war and peace, and that we'll see a persistent competition that could escalate quickly under certain circumstances. the hybrid warfare challenge, centrality information, not just in a supportive way that it has traditionally been, but information as a decisive instrument. And actually, information domain may be the domain where you lose the war even before it started, and therefore being the fundamental one. And also very important that we can't separate and think differently in domains, land, maritime, air, space, and cyber. It's one and the same domain. The forces in the future need to operate as it's one domain and need to be designed for that. And the 3 dimensions where physical and virtual influence the cognitive. And that we are at the strategic technology inflection point. So next picture, please. And my last picture, that's the integrated approach. So when we think about how to deal with this from a conceptual point of view, integration is the key word, and it is the integration across the 5 domains, as I mentioned, but also with the military as part of whole of government approach, because all the different levers, economy, diplomacy, and so on, needs to be connected with the military instrument to provide the right outcomes and effects. And again, that we need to work integrated with allies in a far more closer way than we've done before to build a credible deterrence and freedom of maneuver. And all this is resting on information advantage and a capacity to adapt to changes. That is the key word, adapt to changes, to have a structure with people, systems, a setup that is agile, that provide resilience, that provide high readiness and outreach. And reach is not just physically moving something, it could be through the information and cyber domain. And that you can respond in a way that it will create a level of deterrence. And all this is, of course, not easy to do. It demands a full holistic approach and lots of difficult choices to possibly disinvest in capabilities we always seen as very necessary that may not give us the kind of deterrence or freedom of action in the future that we see them having today. And I'll end my presentation here and ready for questions.
Great, Colonel.
Yep, I hear you well.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I hear you well.
Okay, I have a couple of questions, and I have one from the Twitter sphere and a couple on the from our virtual chat room. From the Twitter world, though I actually think the individual who put it in there is actually in the room with me. But in your presentation, you talked about the wealth and economic activity moving from the west to east. We can't help but notice behind you is a map of Southeast Asia, and a Swedish officer sitting in the UK Defense Force. You don't mention anything about Russia though, which is really the potential. From a near-peer competitor standpoint, is the one geographically that's much closer to the UK, or just definitely to Sweden. From that perspective, why is that? Why China, not Russia? Is it just because of long-term to 2050? Where do you sit?
It's a good question, and it's absolutely certainly so that we don't consider Russia as a threat. Sweden, absolutely so. It is the core threat to Sweden and very much to United Kingdom also. I just possibly failed to mention Russia when we talk about hybrid warfare and those challenges, but very happy to complement my presentation a bit. When we look at Russia, we do see a great power in decline demographically, society-wise, in the long term, also economically. If you look at the Russian population in Far East, which is double as big in space as Europe. There's 6 million people there, 3 million over 65. And the Russian population is in the future is very much concentrated to Moscow and another couple of cities. It's a nation at the same time that want to be a respected great power, that want to have influence, where patriotism is key to everything, people that are ready to sacrifice a lot for being a great power. And the technology level and capacity of Russia is still significant. And we believe that even after regime change, after Putin, the system won't change very much because it's entrenched in the way it is, unless it becomes a revolution. And military power will always be key for Russia to preserve its status. At the same time, Russia is not as strong as Soviet Union, not even remotely so. And even if Europe theoretically put its conventional forces together and you had them in a perfect interoperable use, which is not the case in reality, if that would be the case, it would be far stronger than Russia in itself. And with the US committed to Europe, Russia will be the weaker military part, and that's why they will use very cleverly asymmetric means to compensate for that. And they're good at that. They know how to do that. And there are areas where they will not compromise in Ukraine, for example, in Caucasus, and Central Asia is a question mark how that will play out with China in the long term. And Russia is not likely to all of a sudden change its attitude to Europe, West, US, and will be a formidable challenge the coming decades. I am very happy to compliment with that. So China is not as much a military threat to Europe. There's no state in Europe that sees China as an existential threat. And Europe is pretty much caught in between concern over the Chinese political system, intellectual property right, all these kind of things we share with the US, but not as eagerly willing to be part of the competition and risk prosperity and so on when it comes to China. With Russia, it's very different.
Great response. We appreciate that. So related to that, you talked about data as a commodity. And how do you see that versus the demand for privacy? Because Europe, with EU's general data protection regulations that have been come on, military is going to need data. How do we ensure we have access to that data? We're having pretty different perspectives on who owns their data, where that data sits. It's definitely between the U.S. and the EU, and completely different than maybe the way the Chinese use it for authoritarian purposes. So data as a commodity versus privacy in this future operational environment.
No, I think you're hitting the nail there. It's one of the really big questions and challenges in the future, societal point of view. Will our young generations born in the 90s be more accepting of that you have someone checking and controlling and looking at your data or not? Where does your individual integrity goes in a society that is becoming completely data-driven? And where goes the limit of the better good and how to protect yourself and your integrity? And we think perspectives will change here. We will get used to much more control and interference. But where the limit goes is very difficult to say, and there is a diversity there. But coming back to the control of data is really a tricky one. And non-state actors as the tech giants comes into this picture. Where will their loyalties lie in the future? And can states provide a playing ground for digital trade, for example, how we deal with data and how we tax information in the future that is borderless, and how will the tech giants act there? And of course, an American tech giant like Google is not necessarily loyal to the US state, while they're probably more loyal to the profit they're making, while a Chinese tech giant, there will be no choice. They will obviously be loyal to the Chinese state and part of Chinese reach and influence. And this is part of the power game. And of course, the recent British government decision to allow the Chinese tech giant of Huawei to be part of 5G is a reality in many of the European countries. But the government's point of view is that this is done under real extensive consideration of what needs to be secure and what cannot be compromised and so on. And this will also be part of the greater competition of the greater part of great power competition over control of data, and how that's seen by our alliance partner. Will it be possible to build tech alliances in the future to counter China? And I can only say that the trends indicate it will be a tricky one with the ever-growing dependence on the growing Chinese economy. And in the end, when we look at the great power competition between US and China, I think the key question mark comes back to what kind of country China will be in the future. If China develops into a more assertive, aggressive power, it will probably lead more countries to cooperate against them. If they develop into a more confident, transparent power that is not seen as a threat, then it will be a different picture. But we don't know that yet, and we don't even know if China will manage in the end, with all the challenges they have internally, for the Communist Party to stay in power in 2050. And it all comes back again to its possibility to deliver prosperity to its population. And if they fail there, the party will fail, and it will be a huge degree of uncertainty how it will react in such a development, which probably won't be a very good one.
Colonel Isacsson, one last question from a virtual attendee who wanted to know, on your slide 11, you didn't mention information operation campaigns against the general populations of Western democracies. They would like you to address that.
Sorry, I missed that one. Do you mind repeating it, please? Sorry, I missed that one. Do you mind repeating it, please?
Yes, sir. They were curious as to why information operation campaigns against the general populations of Western democracies hadn't been addressed on your slide 11.
I think that is something that's going on as we speak. It's this kind of influence operation is not something you just realize that, okay, we need to influence that group of people or that opponent or this country. An influence operation is an ongoing thing that can be escalated or put more efforts into. And I think there's already enough evidence that Russia is trying in different ways to undermine the democratic states of Europe, to create a divide between them, make it more difficult to unify. And if you look at the trend of centrality of information, it's becoming much more difficult to separate what is true and not true. We can't tell young people or people in general that they should only believe what they see in BBC News, which might not even be true that either. So, and people are building their preferences from a full load of sources. And I think the democratic state is under challenge when it comes to misinformation in a number of areas that is also used by populist parties that try to exploit this for their wins and so on. The good thing is that there is an awareness of this, and I can take the example from Sweden, where the government is investing in much more source-critical education in schools already from the very beginning, trying to teach how you challenge the information you see and question it. And this, I think, needs to be a theme all the way through. And then, of course, we need to be good at counter this and building a narrative that people believe in, that is stronger than our opponents. And of course, we shouldn't hesitate to influence those we need to influence either.
So Colonel Isacsson, that was great, and you're concerned that we were hearing the same thing as it was not true, because there were common themes, but the 6 drivers of conflict are very good. They're kind of big themes that you can get your hands around and talk through. A couple of things to point out I thought was interesting. You talked about biotechnology, you talked about threat. What was mentioned by the officer from the Netherlands when he was talking about the dikes of protection, one he talked about was people, and he talked about biotechnology from human enhancement perspective. I know the British Army, the British Defense Forces thought about this because I've seen some of that work before. You just focused on the biotech side of threat, but biotech is a big one. You finished with the idea of narrative and truth. We heard that from every officer that spoke today, or every representative from their governments. I'm glad you brought up Sweden, because Sweden and Finland have the 2 really examples of how you take a societal approach in the educational system to deal with influence operations, probably because both of those countries sit very close to a country that has gotten very good at influence operations. So that is probably the only 2 examples I can think of as we talk about all these countries that are struggling with this, who have both taken a proactive approach. There's been several good articles written in the U.S. about Finland, and they're doing the same thing Sweden's done as far as critical thinking, understanding what you're hearing, questioning that as you go forward, because it's a military problem without a real military solution. There's some things the military can do, and each one of our armies are building capability, but in reality, we're on the periphery of a problem. It's like you're being targeted with indirect fire by an adversary that you can't counterfire and reach them. We're being impacted by these influence operations, but the ability to impact it is difficult. So that string's pretty good, and I didn't say that for myself, Matt. I said that because I expect to see it in a report. That this idea that each one of these militaries are trying to work through how to do this, but it's been a common theme, I think is important. Our next presenter we'll actually hear from is a Canadian officer who is going to be talking about military influence operations and how to deal with it as each one of our nations are working through that. So we appreciate your time today. You will be proclaimed an Army Mad Scientist. I actually have the documentation with me. It will be mailed to you. I think you might be the first Swedish Army Mad Scientist. There are a few British Army Mad Scientists out there, but you're one of a kind, and you'll have the documentation to prove it, along with some swag to put there in your office, right next to your map of Asia. That our Australian friend wanted to ask you about. You're not part of the Commonwealth, so he thought he was going to take a jab at you. Colonel Isacsson, though you have served with the Commonwealth since 2013. But we appreciate your time, and we'd ask you to continue to listen in. We have a couple of resources. I'll mention it to you and to everybody else. Our MadSci lab. I hope you've gone to madsciblog.tradeactarmy.mil and looked at all the writing. We have a lot of writing from international people as well. A lot of the topics you talked about are addressed. We have to the right, if you go there, you'll see our current changing character of warfare assessment and unclassified assessment. You'll see a video. There's a survey there, Colonel Isacsson, that we'd love you to take and to share with your office about the future. It takes about 5 minutes to take as we're doing some analysis as part of this. So take a look at that and share that in your office and with your networks overseas. And like I said, we appreciate your time.
Okay, thank you.